going to look for our first presenter. We can probably go ahead and get some. Here we go.
We were downstairs. We didn't realize we were so.
Okay. Okay. We are live on the microphones here. By the way, the microphone, the only microphone we have is here on the computer. So when you're talking, you need to use your teacher voice or speak up. So we're all here. First thing we ought to do is call the roll to get started here. So Phyllis, if you could call the roll, please.
Ms. Chansey?
Here.
Mr. Edwards?
Here.
Mr. Ferguson?
Here.
Ms. Hargrove?
Here.
Mr. Johnson?
Here.
Ms. Kim?
Here.
Dr. Trout? Dr. Trout? Ms. Tucker?
Here.
Ms. Cook? Ms. Cook? Mr. Austin?
Here. Okay, we do have a quorum present, so we will begin. Certainly appreciate everybody making an opportunity to. We noted earlier that this is the State Board of Education Christmas party, so we appreciate you being able to join us for that. We do want to express welcome to Alicia Kim and to Gordon Ferguson. This is their first board meeting, so we will have a chance to participate with them in more of our regular board meetings come January. But Alicia and Gordon, we certainly appreciate you being part of this board. Just a note, I hope that all the board members had a chance to participate in the teacher preparation report card launch this morning. A great event, and I think that it's really everything we've been wanting to see and looking for and hoping we would see for some time now. So it's a great event, and appreciate everybody who was involved in planning that. All the state board staff really did a great job of getting that together, and I think that Spencer and Laura deserve a lot of credit for kind of spearheading this thing, getting it put together. So great event. Mike, I hope you had a chance to join us, but I think you would have particularly really enjoyed this. Did you?
I did, and I had a board meeting, but Spencer and Laura sure have done a great job on it. I agree.
You need to get on that website if you haven't so far and check it out, because it really is impressive, and we appreciate all that good work. The first item is to approve the agenda for the meeting. Is there a motion that we approve the consent agenda?
So move, Mr. Chairman.
Got a motion, second? Got a second? Any discussion? Okay, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Agenda is approved. Okay, the report items. A to F school grading system. Dr.
I'll start and
Okay,
turn it over
okay,
to
great.
Dr. Towns. So this is a presentation that is actually part of the larger ESSA presentation that we will be doing at the January board meeting. This is a specific area, though, that we wanted to go ahead and give you a preview of, as we are in a consistent feedback period right now with public town halls, as well as our public comment period on our full draft starting on Monday through the end of January. So we know that we could have spent half a day with you talking about ESSA at our January workshop, and so I appreciate the opportunity to split this up into two different sessions. We're focusing just today on a new a school accountability framework that is part of our ESSA work, as well as a new state law. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Towns to walk you through a draft of this plan, and would love to have your feedback.
Great. So I think you all have seen a preview of this presentation, but
myself and Mary Badawala, the Executive Director of Accountability, want to walk you through the specific element of school accountability that is new under the ESSA framework and will be a part of our ESSA state plan. So I'm going to walk us through the overview for accountability, and then I'm going to hand it off to Mary to talk us through the design approach for grading and looking at weighting and modeling outcomes. When we look at these proposed state frameworks, we try to look at actual historical data and see how this was played out. So we'll talk through that, and then I'll close us out by just revisiting what are some of the key points and highlights, and certainly we can go to questions at that point, or please feel free to stop us if you have questions along the way. So for the overview, as we've discussed, in this ESSA reauthorization, we are now required to meaningfully differentiate all schools on an annual basis. And that's a new criteria. In our state, we actually weren't doing school accountability beyond focus and priority schools. But now ESSA has said you must meaningfully differentiate annually all schools. Also, during the last legislative session, we passed, our Tennessee state legislature passed, a law requiring that all schools earn a summative letter grade of A through F. So we've got both of these requirements, one coming federal, one coming from the state, and so we are basically moving to try to align these two in this proposed framework. So in thinking about school accountability, we always try to think of our overarching philosophy and guiding principles, because really those play into how do we get to the modeling choices that we've made, some of the design choices that we've made. And so I'll start with these kind of top 4 guiding principles. First of all, we believe that all schools should have the opportunity to earn an A. A lot of the critique that you've seen of A through F in other states is that it's felt like it's just a stack ranking of poverty, right? That if it's heavily based on achievement, what ends up happening is that high poverty schools end up at the bottom of the ratings, and then those more affluent schools end up at the top. But poverty is not destiny in this model, and Mary will talk you through that you absolutely will have a full range of schools being able to earn those higher letter grades. All means all. We are very focused on equity in our state, and you will see that each of the indicators that we talk about for A through F would not only be reported for all student groups, but we would break those out to look at the underserved student groups. All growth should be rewarded. This means that we know that schools with low achievement and high growth can be rewarded, as well as incremental growth. There are no miss of targets. We're going to give a recognition to any progress that a school is making that's improvement. And then finally, reporting should be transparent. So when we talk about the dashboards, we know we're going to end up at a summative letter grade, but in between that, the public wants to be able to see how do we get there? What were the components of that single letter grade? And so you'll see that play out. So what are our intended outcomes? We want this school accountability framework to reward both performance and progress. You've heard us talk about that in our state with reward schools, which we implemented with our NCLB waiver. So we continue that ethos around looking at both performance and progress. We want to reward positive school culture and engagement of students such that they're in school. We know our ability to educate children and increase learning gains increases obviously when they're there. We're looking at readiness for post-secondary and workforce. We're really making a strong statement around what does that mean and what evidence do we have that our graduates are ready for post-secondary and workforce. And then ultimately that leads to this notion of improved life trajectory for our students. We want our students to leave us after earning their diploma and be able to embark upon their chosen path in life. That's our vision. So how are we setting students up for those choices? So what does that mean in terms of the specific indicators? So we have 4 indicators that primarily drive the school accountability framework. The first of those is achievement, and we'll talk about what that means. Growth, student growth. I'll talk through each one of these in details. English learners, their progress towards English proficiency. And then we've introduced these 2 indicators of school quality and student success. The opportunity to learn indicator and the ready graduate indicator, and I'll talk about those in detail. So first, achievement. We have 2 ways of looking at achievement, and we have 2 pathways that we're going to be measuring in this proposed framework. First is absolute proficiency. That is the achievement benchmark. Historically, we've talked about that as proficient or advanced. with our new TN Ready assessment, we refer to that as on track or mastered. So when we look at the different content areas, initially we'll be thinking about which of our schools are at the top of that achievement stack ranking, if you will. So for our baseline data, we would say that in the achievement indicator, a school could earn an A on this pathway by being in the top 20%. So if you're in the top 20% of schools in terms of absolute achievement, that percent of students who are on track or above, then you would be recognized with an A in the achievement indicator. But we do know that there is a relationship, a strong correlation between achievement and poverty. So we have this second pathway that says, how do we make sure that we're recognizing schools that may have low absolute achievement, but actually be doing some important and dramatic work around improving achievement? So that's when we look at these annually measurable objectives, so the AMO targets. And essentially, we set targets for schools based on where they are and for rates of improvement. So we want these targets to be ambitious but achievable. We've historically defined these as being able to reduce by 50% in 8 years the percentage of students who are not on track, so non-proficient students. So an example of that is if today I have 50% of my students who are not on track, in 8 years, I would want to see that number cut in half to 25%, right? So on the math, it works out to be a 6.25% reduction each year. A school who might be able to earn an A in the achievement indicator based on this pathway would need to double that AMO target, 200% of the target we set. So what would that mean? That school would be on a trajectory to cut in half the percent of students who are not proficient in 4 years. So let me say that again. They would be cutting that in half in 4 years. For those of you who've been close enough to this work for a long time, you know that would be a remarkable rate of progress. And that school is really changing the dynamic and the achievement outcomes in that school to be on that kind of trajectory. So we know that both of these are rigorous pathways to potentially earn an A in achievement. Is there a question on the line? Okay, so I'll move forward. We looked at this and looked at our 2014-15 data, and we saw that we had about, Mary will speak to this, but I'll just preview it. We had about 13% of our schools that earned an A on the achievement indicator based on absolute proficiency. We had about 11% of our schools who could earn an A in achievement based on this AMO goal. So it's possible, but it's rigorous. And we only really have about a tenth of our schools that are able to do it. Then we had another 7% of our schools who were able to earn an A on the achievement indicator on either pathway. So we know that we have a rigorous standard around achievement. The second indicator is growth. You all are familiar with the value added system, the TVAS system. And what TVAS looks at is an individual student level growth measure. And we are looking at whether a student made the expected growth of a year. So it doesn't matter if that student is meeting the achievement benchmark in terms of being on track. We're looking at any progress that shows that that student has made the expected learning gains from a year's worth of instruction. So the TVAS growth indicator is the second part of the school accountability framework. English language proficiency. This is new in ESSA as well. We had typically had a separate accountability framework for EL students. We are now bringing EL students into the base accountability model. And so what this means is for those schools who have a sufficient number of students in their English learner subgroups, we'll be looking at those students' progress towards English proficiency. We measure that based on the WIDA Access exam. That's our English language proficiency assessment in Tennessee. So that's not the TN Ready English Language Arts exam, but we're actually looking at English language proficiency test, the WIDA Access. So now let's talk about the measure of school quality and student success. This is also a new requirement and component of ESSA, but something that has certainly been aligned with our thinking in Tennessee in terms of wanting to look at data that may not be test data that gives us an indication of our goals in terms of student outcomes. So we talk about opportunity to learn, and what we really mean is, you know, are students with us in school with a qualified teacher of record who's demonstrating effective instruction. That's the goal, that's the concept here. And in looking at this and thinking through the initial implementation of school accountability, we decided that we want to focus on chronic absenteeism. as the representative of the opportunity to learn metric. So we've defined chronic absenteeism as any student who's missing more than 10% of the school year. So a student missing more than 18 days of school, we would define as chronically absent. And so we would be looking at, in this indicator, either rewarding schools who have an overall low rate of chronic absenteeism, so a small proportion of students who are missing more than 10% of school, or they're reducing that rate. So if they're having success in reducing the rate of students who are chronically absent.
Dr. Towns?
Yes.
This is Lillian Hartgrove.
Hi, Lily.
I have a question relative to the terminology, the opportunity to learn indicator, and in the relevancy to transparency, and in meeting with the Upper Cumberland directors of schools, their concern in using that language is that parents will not understand unless, it's more clearly defined exactly what we're talking about when we say opportunity to learn indicator. So if in transparency, if we call it what it is, this is what directors are suggesting, why don't we use the language that parents will understand what that means? So can you speak to that a little bit? And then I want to come back with a follow-up question relative to teacher absenteeism.
Sure. So to your first question, I think that's a great point. And really in all of these, we're going to have a very prolonged and extensive engagement with parents to educate them around the school accountability framework. We would not be actually introducing this until the fall of 2018 for the first reporting. So we have some time. The reason that we've couched this under opportunity to learn as opposed to just saying chronic absenteeism, because we are exploring other indicators. You previewed that you want to ask me about teacher absenteeism. That's one thing that we've explored and talked about. We've also talked about discipline data. So in future years, we may be expanding this beyond chronic absenteeism to include an index that would not only be chronic absenteeism, but may also include discipline data and then other metrics that we continue to research. So we're positioning this for the future.
Yeah, I think I would add, though, I think it's an excellent point. I actually heard that same point at one of the town halls. And so we feel like during the first year, you absolutely could call this chronic absenteeism because that's what it is. But the intent is that in this index, the opportunity to learn index, you would be adding other things. But we would have to be very transparent that what this is for this next year that we would be using it, it would be chronic absenteeism data. I think it's an excellent point, and we will work to make that clarification actually in how we even frame this on a report card, so it's very obvious what data is in it.
I think so, because it could be an ongoing educational opportunity with parents over, forever, to make sure that they understand what that is. So I would certainly want to see clarity around that. And I understand the point that you're making in terms of other indicators being a part of that. And so you did say that you all have discussed teacher absenteeism because students' opportunities are clearly impacted by teacher absenteeism, and that certainly is an area of concern. And the directors brought that to my attention, so I thought it would be important for us to talk about that in terms of your thinking for the future and how that would be included.
Yeah, no, great point. And we had a lot of conversation across the state with different stakeholder groups where this has come up. So two challenges as we start to look at teacher absenteeism. First of all, we don't collect it at the state level right now. So our first step that we're committed to is to update our data system. So we're collecting that information from all of our districts in our education information system. So once we start to gather that information, I think the second concern that we heard is that folks wanted to make sure that we didn't have any unintended consequences in terms of the way we looked at this metric. So all of the things that happen in schools, like people taking maternity leave or being out for some serious illness, that directors of schools expressed to us that they wanted to make sure we weren't penalizing schools for those types of life events that we certainly want and expect that teachers would use their sick leave for. So as we begin to collect the data, what we want to do is then think about a set of business rules in terms of what kind of absences we would capture to be able to produce a teacher absenteeism rate that people feel like is fair and transparent and actually captures the kind of data that we want to capture. So it's something that we've committed to collecting, reporting on transparently, and then taking a look at perhaps 2 to 3 years down the road to see if it's appropriate to include in accountability.
Right, and Lillian, you will know when y'all see the ESSA draft next week, and then we'll talk more about this at our January board meeting, we have a list of transparency metrics that we will begin reporting, that they wouldn't actually be physically in the accountability model. And this is one of those, but we first have to start with getting the data, making sure we're defining the absences appropriately across the districts. But it is, it's a very valid.
I can appreciate
area.
that.
Right.
And that sounds very fair and reasonable. Thank you.
Yes, this is Mike. How did we get to 10%?
Oh, in terms of defining that as chronic absenteeism, some of it is really just what's been accepted in terms of education research who's looked at this, in terms of just kind of defining a cut point for what seems to be a rate of absenteeism that's detrimental to student learning outcomes. So I think it's just been landed at from accepted practice across education research landscape. Commissioner, do you have anything to
No,
add?
I mean, that's right. And you know, most states use some version
Mhm.
of this percentage. And so it is a commonly accepted percentage, but there's no other real, reason for that. There's nothing that we have got to follow this particular federal rule on this particular
That's right.
item.
Okay,
Okay. So then we'll move into the second measure of school quality and student success, but I wanted to take a step back and define the terminology. You hear us refer to EPSOs, these early post-secondary opportunities. So we have this whole wide range in the puzzle pieces of those types of opportunities that we provide in our state. So most commonly you hear people talk about advanced placement courses, our dual enrollment, dual credit courses, but we also have international baccalaureate and other of these early post-secondary opportunities. Why is this important? We've looked at our data and we've seen that those students who are experiencing 4 or more of those EPSO courses have a 50% chance of meeting that 21 or higher on the ACT, as well as there being a body of empirical research that says that these experiences have a positive correlation to improving college grades and persistence through college, students' ability to actually earn that credential. So we know that this is important to our students, and we really want to try to integrate this into our check for readiness. As we talk about the Ready Graduate Indicator, just to give you a little bit more data, when we looked at our class of 2015 cohort, we saw that a little less than 40% of our students were earning even one EPSO. That is to say, participating rather in even one EPSO opportunity. So that means 60% of our students weren't. And we really feel like we want to open up that access for students. When we looked at the 4 EPSOs, we had a just shy of 17% of students who have participated in 4 EPSO opportunities. So really our goal here as we think about this Ready Graduate Indicator is that we want to increase access to these early post-secondary opportunities. So how are we going to start talking about the Ready Graduate? We've looked at graduation rate in Tennessee and had a focus on that. We've been very successful. Our most recent graduation rate was 88.5% for the class of 2016, and that's one of the highest in the country. We're actually top 10. Tennessee's number 9 in the country for graduation rates. Now we want to talk about what are our students equipped to do when they leave us then with that diploma? And so we have 3 checks for readiness, for workforce and post-secondary readiness that we want to look at for our graduates. So a ready graduate would be a graduate in 4 years in the summer who's demonstrated either one of these 3 indicators. The first is being able to score a 21 or higher on the ACT. We know that's going to qualify that student for the Hope Scholarship, and it's going to meet the minimum qualifications for admissions in Tennessee colleges and universities. But for those students who haven't perhaps met that 21 benchmark, what's a second check that we might have for post-secondary and workforce readiness? So we've landed at that 4 EPSOs. And in this case, we have clarified that the 4 EPSOs is the completion, not just participation. And we're defining completion as not only did you complete the course, but you also sat for any qualifying exam. So if you're in AP, that means you had to sit for the AP test. For statewide dual credit, that's the statewide challenge exam, whatever that may be. Question?
You have to pass.
You don't have to meet a minimum score. So you don't have to pass. This first level is exactly.
Right.
This first level is
Couple years,
participation.
because we have so few people actually getting even one. And we posted this with lots of groups, and it is one that, we have to consider that we have a lot of folks that don't have any access right now, or they don't have many students taking advantage of even one. The intent would be over time that we're actually transitioning to. This means you actually got the credit in terms of, you scored a certain number on the AP, or you actually got the credit for X. this is showing based on the data, and Mary I know can speak to that too, that completion of 4 EPSOs gave you a significant chance to actually have the 21 on the ACT for entry into college.
So yeah, I think to that point, the data that we collected last year with you, that's not even considering whether or not the students actually completed the challenge exam. So we are one level up from just participation and saying we want you to complete the course with a challenge exam, but we do feel like that access step is the first step before we start talking about the performance piece.
So I don't agree with that, but I understand what you're saying, but that makes 1 and 2, those are 2 very different schools. So if I have a school that's scoring high because kids are scoring a 21 or higher on the ACT, that is a very different grade, or it should be a very different grade. And here it looks like it would be the same grade as a school that just offers AP to everybody who wants to walk in. And if you're a warm body in a desk, you get the same grade. Am I reading that wrong?
Yeah, I think the difference here in terms of, I definitely understand the concern. I think from our perspective, that having students sit for that qualifying exam is a check for the rigor and the quality of that particular course. So we would argue, and this has actually been borne out in research, that if you're getting the rigorous course experience, that even if you aren't necessarily earning the credit as an initial first step, that's still of some benefit to you in terms of having had that experience. Where we do think it falls down is that if you're sitting in an AP course, but you never even take the AP exam and nobody intended for you to take the AP exam, then that's a different level of rigor of the course and your engagement in the course if you're not actually even going to be preparing for the qualifying test. So that's where we're trying to lean in.
Just sort of piggyback on this, and I'm trying to remember some of the conversations we had at the assessment task force early on,
Mm-hmm.
but I mean, one thing I've been excited about in terms of the opportunities under ESSA is to better incentivize this access to, you know, these EPSOs as we're calling them. Because I do think the research is clear that having access and participating in these classes, you know, is a really strong indicator of potential, you know, completion of high school and persistence in post-secondary. At the same time, is there a plan to report out on sort of the success rate in those classes, you know, while we're sort of, you know, pushing access first?
Absolutely.
So that's what you'll see, and we don't have it in this presentation, but the link that you'll see on Monday, you'll see in the section on accountability, we have basically a table of the transparency metrics that would accompany this. That is essentially saying we're going to start reporting on multiple things, that being one of them, and with the intent that we have that data, we start modeling that, but they would actually become part of the accountability model. So it's almost like that, you get a year, 2 years to say this is coming. You need to start with access first. You know, again, in Memphis and one of my town hall sessions, there was a great concern. You know, we don't even have any early post-secondary options at my school, right? So like, we got to start somewhere, right? You have to. This is now spurring conversation, even in a draft form.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got to start thinking differently about what you're providing for all of your students. But that's exactly right. We'll have all the transparency metrics. The intent would be to eventually have them as part of the accountability. But we have to have some modeling too of what would be the appropriate weighting. You know, how do they stack up against other metrics that you have in here as well?
That was the question I was going to ask about capacity in schools for. So if they take an AP or AP classes or EPSOs, the dual credit, dual enrollment, they have to be offered, and they really ought to be those courses that are going to be relevant to their career path. So and AP English would fit in there with everybody, I guess, but there's for some of them, but some of them not. And the dual credit and dual enrollment, I think, is really underutilized by a lot of schools for, I guess, a number of reasons. But what you're saying, Commissioner, is that we recognize that, and this is a step toward getting districts to be more aggressive in those EPSOs.
Yes, and I think both of you are right. We've got to first move it in that direction. The point is credit. Mm-hmm. Right, we're saying you got to start here, but we're moving to you've got to have a certain number of kids, percentages that actually are getting the credit, and we're going to start reporting that story. And we have districts that are doing a good job here, but the vast majority are not even where they need to be on an access point.
So
This is a good field. This is real good.
I was gonna save this for the end, but I think just so you know, like where my head is, I'm having a really hard time reconciling, I think, the purpose behind the A through F statute that I followed and was passed. And I don't know if it's because we're trying to mix it with ESSA or what, you know, the accountability mix, but if that statute, and I checked with Senator Gresham, who ran that statute's office today to make sure I wasn't wrong, it was intended for parents to be able to look at a school and see what level of education their kid would get if they go to that school. And an A is meant, in her mind, and when the legislature passed it, as a high-performing school. And an F is meant as a school that's not, and you know, growth obviously plays a role there, but the bottom line for that statute was an A school is a really great, high-performing, getting kids ready to college school, not a school that's on the pathway to that. And this feels to me like it's not that, because of the doubling the AMOs can give you an A in achievement. And while I appreciate the challenge of that, if I'm a parent and I look at a school and it's an A, I think when I walk into that school, those kids are all getting prepared for college. And I understand this whole correlation between achievement and poverty, but I also understand that there are high poverty schools knocking it out of the park. And so it feels like we're accepting that poverty is destiny when we're analyzing and doing this. And the other thing that I wrote here, that it's important for all schools to have an opportunity to achieve an A. I get that, but the way I think that statute was meant and the way I look at it is all students should have access to an A-level school. And so I just feel like this is a little bit, in my mind, flipped. So if I'm looking and a school gets the highest possible score because, you know, it's in my district, you know, all the kids score a 21 or higher. And then there's a school in another district where they just said, oh, look, we can get a really good grade if we give a bunch of these AP classes and stick a teacher in there and, you know, let the kid. I just have a problem with that as far as parents getting a real view of what the schools are. So throw that out there.
Well, I appreciate the comments, and certainly from your district, one of your superintendents, I've had you know, lengthy conversations on this issue. And I would first say that we believe this is a very fair, just model that we're continuing to get feedback on. And where we started was that poverty shouldn't be the reason why, and we have a high correlation in our own data, shouldn't be the reason why you don't even have the opportunity to grow fast enough to get an A. At the end of the day, this is in a dashboard. So you click on whatever that summative grade is, and you can see, we'll show you that it's in the PowerPoint, you can see what those grades are for, right? You can see, did that school get an A in achievement because it was absolute achievement? They were in the top 20%? Or was it an A because they doubled the AMO target and they're moving, you know, rapidly and changing that life trajectory for a student? And so there is ability from a parent perspective to have lots of transparency into what that grade was. But this is also about motivating the school to say, from a school perspective, they have to have transparency within the model as well to be able to make decisions about where am I going to go next? What am I going to do? And growth has been the model that we have used as sort of the foundation of our district accountability model. And it has really worked for Tennessee. I mean, I think about the growth that we have had as a state has been remarkable, and it's because people felt like there was an ability to grow and to be recognized and rewarded for that. So in Tennessee, it has been a major factor in our success. And so to somehow have a disconnect between what we're doing in district accountability and what we believe has worked for us with school accountability doesn't seem like the connection that we would want to go forward with in Tennessee, right? We want these two things connected. We want to look at what's worked for us, and these guiding principles have really been what we said, this is what's worked for us under district accountability. Let's use a version of that to make an alignment with school accountability, and now say we're going to dig deeper into not only what's happening at the district level, but where are you at a school, and provide transparency around those criteria. And Nikki, you can speak to the AMO targets and, sure, and really the modeling we did around that to say this is hard to do. And if you really are doing that at a school level, you are moving that student from where they started on a trajectory for post-secondary that's pretty remarkable from where they ended up starting place that they have.
And I get that, but as a parent, if I look at a school and it's an A, I don't expect to have 10% proficiency in the school. And I understand you can click on a dashboard, but I mean, parents, what a school's gonna do is like, we're an A, and parents are gonna be like, oh, okay. I mean, it's not like you're gonna have a bunch of parents digging on a dashboard. The whole point of that statute was to make it A, B, C, D, F. And so that's what I'm.
So I do think, so this is a conversation that we've had with a lot of people, and it's a tough, frame to have, right? So on the one hand, when you think about parents, and we've had this conversation a lot within various groups, what I want as a parent to know is what is the level of academic press in that school. And I want to know that if I send my child there as a high achieving student, that if I'm a middle class, well educated parent, and we've invested all this time in working with my child at home, and that child walks in, as a high achieving student, I want to know that the academic press in that school is such that my child is going to continue to grow. And we could make a case around continuous improvement that school who's got a 10% absolute achievement, if they've been doubling their AMO target every year, the academic press in that school is phenomenal. And that if I send my child there, who's a high achieving student, they're gonna get the experience of that culture with that high academic press, and they too are gonna be on a successful trajectory that perhaps lands them in a place that even wouldn't have been possible with just my home support. So we're trying to change the conversation of performance to say, what is the culture in that school that takes the student wherever they are and leans into being able to grow that student, high achieving, low achieving across the continuum. So that's really what this model is doing, that it's saying that just because you walk into a school that has a lot of high achieving students does not mean the culture of academic press is there. And there are lots of indicators that help us do that. And we're showing you all of those indicators that help you as a parent say, where is the school culture where they're pressing for greater achievement, no matter where those students are? And I can make the argument that that's harder to do in terms of pressing at that rate in a place where absolute achievement is lower. Mike.
So let me follow Wendy's line a little further. I'm going to regret this. By definition, if there is a high growth school that gets an A, then theoretically, previous to that, there was an F school that allowed them to get so far behind, that allowed them, that gave the capacity for growth. The second thing is,
no,
so
I don't. That premise isn't. I just want to correct. That's not necessarily true. As I noted, there were 7% of schools who earned the A in achievement on both pathways. So we have we have high achieving schools that are also high growth. 7%,
yeah,
7%, 13% just on absolute, 11% on the AMO.
So here's my. You can be on a growth trajectory that is favorable, but unless and we've looked at these numbers in the last couple of weeks of the number of high school graduates in Tennessee who get into some post-high school training, whether it's a TCAT or any type of post, and the success rate is not good, to put it. So that trajectory, while it may have looked great and was great, it didn't launch it into orbit. And that's where the parent wants to know, is that when they cross the finish line, are they ready? And that's the A. And we can give other subgrades. We can talk about where within the education profession how things are working and how. But to the parent, they want to know the end game. And the other thing is that I have a problem with on the A through F, there's a lot of avenues to get an A. And we just, we've talked about that, or I have enough. And I understand the feds, but when I look at the difference between the bottom five, the number of A's are theoretically limitless. The number of F's are 5%. The number of schools that would be considered performing at something less than preparing kids are greater than that. So when I look at D, and I'm trying to differentiate that from an F from the standpoint of my kid, or maybe even a C, it starts to get really a distinction without a difference. And that 5% almost, it really is, it's an arbitrary number. Because for the same reason we could have limitless number of A's, theoretically, we could have that same number of F's. And when you look at the number of kids who are performing post-high school or not performing, we got some issues. I'm with Wendy that a parent, this needs, I understand we don't want to, one, offend, two, certainly don't want to demoralize, but at the same time, there needs to be some fidelity in how we describe these.
Let me just make a comment here. You know, I think the motivational thing of considering growth is just terribly important. I just see that every time I turn around. I think that is something that we really need to build into this thing and make sure we don't take it away completely, which we could do if we didn't consider growth. And the other thing is that I think we've been so successful at promoting growth and measuring growth and so forth that we need to be able to continue to do that. So I really believe that growth needs to be part of this equation. Now, whether it's exactly like this or some way else, I think growth has to be part of the determination.
And I just to clarify, I think growth is one of the most important things too. But when a parent is looking at a school, and I mean, I'm a parent, and so maybe I'm, not as altruistic as others, but if I'm looking at school, I want to see like that the school is pushing hard. But if it's a school with single digit proficiency, I want to know that, because am I going to put my kid in that school if I can go to a school with high achievement where kids are ready for college and they're pushing kids? Probably not. I'm going to go to that higher. And if this is about parent information to be able to utilize choice in their schools, which is what the bill was written for, then that's what I'm looking at. If it's about making schools, feel good about their growth, I think there needs to be another. I mean, I think growth is great, but I don't think it's an A. That's just, when I was in school and I was learning chemistry, which I struggled with, shockingly, and, I went from a C to a B, that was a big deal. But I mean, I didn't get an A because I grew. I mean, I just think it needs A through F should mean A through F. And
of course, then it becomes a question of how many different measures you want to have out there. And I think it starts to get confusing if you got, 2 or 3 or 4 different measures for a particular school. So
I would add one other item to that. The confusion also comes from things being misaligned. And there was, we didn't put this as a guiding principle in the groups that we talked with. It was important to have alignment between how are we talking about district accountability, how are we talking about school accountability, how are we talking about A through F, how are we talking about priority schools. So there's not this perception, you got this priority school list over here, you're doing something different on F's, and you got something else going on over here with district accountability. That was very confusing, and the way that we're actually going to get to the finish line of the state really is to say there is an alignment between the work that we're doing among these different schools that we can all understand, which is also what a parent wants, right? They want to understand how do these things fit together, how that school is conceptualizing it. I don't disagree, but I would say that in this, and I think there's some conversation that, Wendy, I think we can have about the weighting piece, which does weigh into your comment, that I actually think we are flexible on thinking through differently than how we have it currently modeled, although there's a reason why we modeled it the way that we did, so there's going to be gives and takes on that too. But my point is, a parent will be able to go in and see how did that school meet that goal, meaning we do have that transparency around it, and that final grade does mean something. It does mean that you've got all of these criteria and some kind of alignment around that weighting, that is saying that that student is on a positive life moment where they are going to be able to have some achievement in the future, right? It doesn't mean it's a false A where they're not going to have a pathway to success after graduation. In fact, we think this particular item in particular shows that there are multiple pathways to that success for a student. This is about a measure of student success, that moving students to industry credentialing and early post-secondary credits and moving them to 21, that's what we're talking about as a state. I mean, those are pathways. We have CBE pathways now. We have pathways to 4 years. We have pathways to 2 years. And so there are options that we have right now in our state that we think this embodies all of those options of how you move students on a successful trajectory. But I do think we could have conversations with this board and others around the weighting piece, which I think are the opportunities. I think you had a handout.
I think most of it's been solved. I mean, that was mine. Because it does, I hear your point, because it does seem a little bit like false advertising to have 10% of kids, you know, proficient in the school and then call it an A school. You know, and that's not what we're trying to do. I understand that's not the intent, but it is not intuitive, I guess, to the average parent out there who's bothering to take a look at this, because that even implies a certain level of education, like in terms of like wanting to like seek this out and knowledge. That being said, I mean, I was wondering if perhaps the issue is just the weighting, because it's just like, it's so extreme. It's like A or F, you know, and it just may be just like, you know, like when you take grades in school, you know, you might get an A in this topic and a C in this topic. That doesn't mean you're 4.0. You know, that just might mean you're whatever the math is on it. You all do that. So I was just wondering if it was a weighting issue. Or something.
Let's get to that, because I think that could be a great conversation for y'all to weigh in on some feedback we've gotten, right? This is a draft, so we're continuing to really try to refine this.
So just to close this out, the third pathway was the 2 EPSOs and earning the industry certification. And in this case, the student sits for that industry certification exam. They have to actually earn the industry certification. And that is in alignment with our CTE concentrator pathways.
This is maybe the most exciting to me, just because we have such a low number of students actually earning that industry certification, even though we have pathways there. You know, these are CTE concentrators. This is exciting that we're building in how valuable that is for a student, because it's also an opportunity for them to then go to the TCAT and take that initial certification credit hours now and to go on that next pathway. And we have too few students taking advantage of TCATs right after high school. So this is an exciting new pathway for us that we've talked a lot about, but we've done a lot of pathway work on this, but we haven't done a lot to incentivize folks looking at it differently.
Okay.
As part of this, we can go back and make sure that we have enough TCAT pathways. So right now there's about, if I was looking on the web, that there's less than 10, and yet there's a number of certificates out there that are well, there's a whole lot more that can be offered. We just have to open those opportunities up to these kids, whether they do it on the campus or go to the college.
Mr. Chairman,
Allison?
yes, I'm sorry, I know I sound terrible, but a thing I want to throw out there as a teacher. These poverty schools, we need to find ways to attract and retain high-quality teachers. And I think the grading system, that needs to be part of what we're looking at. Because in poverty schools, that's where our high-quality teachers are needed the most. But given a choice, a teacher would much rather go to a school where they're scoring 21 or higher on the ACT. And we need to find ways to attract those teachers to the poverty schools.
Okay. I think that's a point well made, and certainly have a lot of opportunity there. Yep. Thank you, Allison. Okay.
We are going to get into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of the design of the system. That includes the indicators that Nakia just previewed for you. So we're going to kind of backwards back to an A by starting with what an F school criteria looks like. So the first thing that we will do is determine what schools receive an F. And we're going to do this through using what we're calling the minimum performance goal. For those of you familiar with the district accountability framework, this is a concept we have there. And so in order to continue with conceptual alignment, we have this concept here as well. The minimum performance goal for school accountability, A through F grading, will look to see which schools rank in the bottom 5% of absolute achievement. So this is using a success rate, which represents simply the percent of students who are proficient across subjects in the school, specifically at the current time, math, reading, and science. So we're looking for the bottom 5% of schools. This is how we previously identified priority schools. However, there is one new layer that we've added in, and that is we're going to include a safe harbor that removes from that list those schools who have achieved a level 4 or 5 TBOS in the past 2 consecutive years. So this is to align with the statute that has been passed that allows for high growth schools to not be taken over by our state-led intervention, the ASD. So again, we will continue to identify the bottom 5% of schools. These are the schools that we will continue to call priority schools. They will receive comprehensive support, but we will remove out of that list those schools that have shown consecutive years of high growth, which means that we may actually move up to the 6th percentile, because some schools will come out, so we may be moving up to get a total of 5% of schools. As the commissioner mentioned, we, in order to have alignment, will call these schools F schools. So these are the priority schools. They will receive comprehensive support as is detailed in our ESSA draft plan. They will also receive an F. After we pull those approximately 5% of schools out, we will then go on to determine a school grade for every other school. And we will do that by grading the multiple indicators which Nakia just described, and you can see listed here. After we have given a subgrade to each of those indicators, for all students, we will also grade each subgroup or historically underperforming student group on these indicators as well. We will average together the performance of the historically underperforming subgroups within the school to come to an overall grade, which of course will be A, B, C, or D. So that's the basic process for how we get to the school's summative grade. So at a high level, we want to talk about what do we mean when we say an A school, what do we mean when we say an F school. I think we've had some good conversation that gets a little bit about what we are meaning when we say A. So as we've discussed, there is no cap on the number of A schools. And the A rating is based on performance of all students on each of the indicators we've looked at, as well as the performance of these historically underserved student groups on each indicator. And as a reminder, we're talking about racial minority students, Black, Hispanic, Native American, English learners, students with disabilities, and economically disadvantaged students. Those are the 4 groups we're referring to here. We then take those 2 averages and we weight them into an overall grade for the school as a whole. Schools that are, on average, higher achieving or, as we've discussed, dramatically improving their achievement and growing all students and growing these individual student groups will be eligible to receive an A rating. So at a high level, if we sum it all up and what all the math is doing, that is what we are attempting to accomplish through the A grade here. Award high achievement or dramatically improving achieving schools that are also growing both all students and their historically underperforming student groups. We've talked about this a little bit, but I think it's helpful to actually visually look at the data from our state to think about currently how poverty relates to success rates. Yes, poverty is not destiny, but this is our data. So what you're seeing here, each bar represents a school in our state. We have approximately 1,700 schools, so there's approximately 1,700 bars here. And you can see that each color represents a quintile of economic disadvantage percentage. And so those bars that are red are the schools that have very high poverty. They have very high percentages of economically disadvantaged students, 80% or more. Those schools that are blue are those where poverty is very low. They have less than 20% of economic disadvantage. As a reminder, using this definition of economic disadvantage, our state's at about 60% on average economically disadvantaged. So to have less than 20% of your school be economically disadvantaged is well below the state average. So what you're seeing here mapped on the y-axis is the success rate of the school, or the absolute achievement. Basically, the percent of kids on average in the school who are scoring proficient or on our new language on track, on grade level. And so you can see that there is some very distinct clustering of colors. You see on the right-hand side, the vast majority of lines are blue, meaning that, as Nakia mentioned earlier, we know in our state, the vast majority of schools that are low poverty are those schools that have very high absolute achievement. On the other side, you see lots of clustering of red. Again, in our state, although there are exceptions, the vast majority of schools that are high poverty, serving 80% or more of students economically disadvantaged, are schools where absolute proficiency is very low. And you see the pattern shakes out for everywhere in between them. This graph displays the exact same schools. So again, about 1,700 schools, all the schools in our state. But what we're looking at here are which schools received A, B's, C's, and D's in our modeling when we ran our school data through the model we've discussed here today. And what you're seeing is that A schools, which are all of the schools to the right of the letter A there, are of all colors. So again, in this model, just because you serve high percentages of economically disadvantaged students, you can be an A. And that is because of the emphasis on growth that we discussed through the indicators earlier. So you do not see the distinct clustering that we saw in the previous graph. You see quite a rainbow of colors representing that schools from all types of percentages of economic disadvantage are scattered throughout the A through D graph. F is not here because F is determined slightly differently, as we discussed. It's determined in a much more blunt fashion. And in F schools, they overwhelmingly represent high poverty schools. But again, we have allowed those high growth schools to come back.
What definition are we using for economically disadvantaged here?
Because we're using 2015 testing data, we're also using the definition we used in 2015, which is qualify for free or reduced price lunch. So the trend would be the same if we were to use our new directly certified definition. It would just be the percentages would be slightly lower since our average would be slightly lower.
Okay.
So we've looked at A schools, we've looked at how poverty maps onto absolute achievement and what our model is doing. But again, we want to reiterate how we are getting to F schools in this framework. F schools are going to continue to be very similar to priority schools. They are the absolute lowest performing schools in the state, with the exception that we will pull out schools with consistent high growth, which will be defined by having a TVAS level of a 4 or 5 for 2 consecutive years. Again, that is to align with the statute that was passed in recent years. All priority schools receive an F grade. We will only identify priority schools and F schools once every 3 years. Schools will have the opportunity to exit annually if they meet very rigorous criteria. If they exit, they can earn a higher grade. That's very similar to our previous framework, where if schools exited the priority list, they had the opportunity to be called reward. Again, this is very rigorous criteria. We implemented it in 2015, and we only had 2 of our 85 schools exit. It is possible, but it is very rigorous. So again, no more than about 5% of schools will receive an F grade. So we're targeting 5% of schools, and these are the schools that will receive the most comprehensive support that we have to offer. And there's a very concrete plan that will be part of the draft plan you'll see next week for these schools.
Am I the only one that has heartburn with us taking the very, very, very worst, 5% bottom and giving them a priority of work when the bottom 6 to 10 to 15% aren't really that much different. Knox County had great performance scores. And I went through and looked at just about every high school, all the feeder schools, all the elementary schools. Dang. When you get, there's some very middle class, certainly not poor, but the poor was in there as well. That was well over 50% of the kids, closer to 2/3 of the kids were not ready to walk out and do something, which makes me really unimpressed by the bottom 5%.
I think that's a really valid concern, and it's something that we've discussed internally as well. Something that we're not getting into specifics on in this presentation today is the identification of targeted support schools. So these are the schools that we have previously called, and will continue to call, focus schools. The methodology that we used previously for the last 3 years to identify our focus schools was heavily based on the use of a gap calculation. We're changing that methodology a little bit so that we will be aiming and targeting those schools that you're talking about, those schools that are on the cusp of being priority, so schools in this bottom 10%, so 6th to 10th percentile. And ESSA actually provides for some specific strategies that we can outline to support those schools as well. Another feature that I'll add is that under ESSA, there's actually provisions that state if these targeted support schools that you identify do not make improvement given time, and the time limit is 4 years, if they don't make improvement within those 4 years, then they become comprehensive support schools. And so I think, your heartburn is definitely understandable. I do think that under ESSA and under our plan, we will have a very concrete way to make sure that those schools are being addressed in ways that we have not previously.
Just tagging onto that, and this is a little bit sort of out of the top of my head, but I think one of the things I've been sort of thinking about is the trade-offs. There's always, when you're thinking about these weighting kind of measures or how to, keep the incentive for growth, but not sort of muddy the picture for parents. There's so many different trade-offs and considerations. I do think kind of continuing to think about how you identify those schools that are clustered around the bottom, even if they're not sort of objectively just the bottom 5%, may be important, because I do think for transparency and for making sure that we're drawing attention to the schools that are really not performing and in need, is something to consider as we kind of keep tweaking here. So I'm not sure I have an answer necessarily. I know you guys are really thinking about this and thinking about those comprehensive support schools. And even just the fact that we run the priority list kind of every year, even if we're not actually identifying those bottom 5% schools, seems like there would be opportunities to kind of, make sure that the F is a meaningful sort of designation, not only just for the bottom 5%, but for those schools that really parents would see as sort of failing their children, even if it's, like you said, Mary, the 6 to 10%. That makes sense.
So,
Okay.
oh, I'm sorry.
Wait.
Okay. The last section before Nakia gets to the highlights, we just want to share with you what some of the data looked like when we ran this model using 2014-15 test data. And so some key takeaways from looking at the data were that we saw that schools receiving grades A, B, and C represented a full range of schools in terms of economically disadvantaged students served. These next few points here highlight something that Nakia has talked about throughout. 31% of schools received an A on the achievement indicator. So remember, we are providing subgrades for each indicator. So we're talking about on the achievement indicator. 11% of those schools made an A via the AMO pathway only. So these are the schools that, although they are not the top performing schools in the state, they may have low achievement. They're schools that are on a trajectory to reduce the percent of students who are scoring at not on track at a rate of 50% in 4 years. So 11%. Not ton of schools, as you can see. 20% of schools received an A based on absolute achievement. 13% of those 20 received it just based on the relative pathway alone. 7% of them received it because they not only were in the top 20% of achievement in the state, so very high performing, but they were also on that growth trajectory that we view as phenomenal. We also want to highlight that A through D grades earned by schools, these A through D schools represented the full range of racial and ethnic diversity, which we find as important. And overall, although we are focused on growth as part of the framework, it's important to note that the final overall grades trend in the same direction as absolute achievement or success rate. That means that on average, A schools are higher performing than B schools, than C schools, etc. So we do see that relationship, and that is because the achievement indicator provides an absolute achievement pathway. A final note here, as someone mentioned, growth has been a focus for us, and so it is important for us to note that of the schools rewarding an A, almost all, with very few exceptions, earned at least a level 3. Many earned levels 4 or 5, and we'll look at that in a second. This grid here shows you the proposed weighting, and as the Commissioner Nakia noted, weighting is something that is very fluid. This is something we're still having discussions about, but what you're seeing here is the weighting we've used in the models that we're sharing with you today. That does not mean that this might not change, so just keep that in mind.
Let me give you an example of that, Mary, I'm sorry to interrupt, but like for achievement and growth, you see on K-8 in high school, those are equal. We've had conversation, well, should achievement be more than growth? And so that's a continuing conversation that we're very open to. We started here because there was lots of people had lots of opinions that were on very divergent ends of the spectrum on this topic. And so we said, well, let's go ahead and we're going to weight them equally just to have the conversation. And then we can determine based on additional modeling, which we will do around different percentages, as well as additional conversations with stakeholders, where that needs to end up. And quite frankly, conversations with you as a board and where you think those need to be. Sorry, Mary.
Oh, no, that's a great explanation. So this is what, when we're about to look at the results, this is the weighting that we used. And you can see, again, the indicators that we're referring to and what they represent, which Nakia walked us through earlier. So when we ran our 14-15 data through this model, you can see how our schools fared. We've included both how all schools fared as well as we've broken it out by K-8 schools versus high schools, although you can see that there's not dramatic differences. This model doesn't disadvantage high schools or disadvantage K-8 schools by any means. So you can see overall we had about 24% of our schools that received an A. The vast majority of schools received either a B or a C, so 37% of schools received a B and around 27% of schools received a C. We had about 7% of schools receiving a D and almost 6% of schools receiving an F. So I'll mention that there is one extra criteria for F identification that requires us to identify any high school that does not have at least a 60% graduation rate as an F as well. Although we only had one school meet that criteria that didn't meet the bottom 5% criteria. And this is what I mentioned earlier on the highlight slide. As you can see, we're looking at what the schools in each grade, A through F, what their distribution of TBOS was. And so you can see overwhelmingly A schools were schools that were level 5 schools, and then there's some 4s and 3s. There's only one school that was a level A that actually had a level 1. And so you can see that this trend continues across the grade distribution. Increasingly, as you move across, you see that there's more red as a proportion of the bar.
Except C has no red.
C has a total because there's more schools there, but as a proportion of the, like if you look at D, proportionally, proportional to the total. And then F, again, is slightly different. What we see at D is great, all schools have a level 1 or 2. There's no 3, 4, 5 there at level D. The reason that we're seeing a distribution a little bit more at F is, again, the methodology to look and get to an F is slightly different. And we expect F schools, if you're the lowest performing schools in the state, that you not just show high growth in 1 year, that you consecutively show that growth. So that's why there's some schools that may have in that 1 year had a good year, but we're looking for 2 good years at least. And this is what we're aiming to present to the public. Something that would allow them to not only see the summative grade, but would allow them to see how schools performed on each of these indicators. So you can see we would provide this look for both all students as well as our underserved student groups. Underneath the underserved student group information, you could actually click in and see English learners, Black, Native American, and Hispanic students, economically disadvantaged. So you would have much more detailed looks. This is just giving you an idea at the very high level. And you can see how these 2 grades for all students and underserved students come together into an overall grade. Again, the all students grade is weighted at 60% and subgroups are weighted at 40. I'm not sure if we explicitly talked about that, but we've decided to weight subgroups at 40% after lots of stakeholder feedback, as that represents about the same percent of students in our state who identify as racial minority, and around the same percent of students who are ED under our new definition.
Let me give 2 caveats from the feedback you just shared. I think Lillian mentioned on this opportunity to learn indicator. We could obviously put chronic absenteeism there for the first year, so that could change on the actual look. I think that's a suggestion we've now heard a few times. And then also where we would continue to want to have feedback as well as around the weighting.
So that was a high school example. I should have mentioned that. And the difference here is the ready graduate. And so the KA example is very similar. The only difference is we don't have that ready graduate indicator, since that is only pertinent to those schools that serve 12th grade. I'm going to hand it back to Nakia to really summarize and hit the highlights.
So I think we talked about kind of where our philosophy has been as we talked to stakeholders about this, and had lots of communication with directors of schools and different stakeholder groups across the state. We have ensured that the A through F model, frankly, in Tennessee, the way that we are thinking about it is different than what has been done in neighboring states and other places. And so part of what's driving that is that we are making sure that there's an unlimited number of schools that can earn an A. We're not capping the number of A schools. We're allowing any school to earn an A grade. That is, if they are able to demonstrate high absolute achievement or dramatic improvement in achievement. And so we are, in making that choice, we are going to be communicating something different to parents about what great performance means and looking at what our schools are doing. We're limiting the number of schools that will earn the overall F grade by aligning that with the priority school designation, which means it'll be about 5% of schools. We'll look at equity challenges by identifying grades for each of the subgroups in each indicator. And we would be able to pull out those focus schools, the targeted support schools that Mary mentioned, by looking at those subgroup grades for those historically underserved groups. We'll have grades for multiple indicators. We've really struggled with the notion of oversimplifying school performance with a single letter grade, but also trying to make sure that we're communicating the different components that go into looking at school performance. And then we're looking at progress at every performance level. For achievement, we're looking at getting students over that benchmark to on track. And of course, for growth, we're looking at progress across all the different performance levels. So that's looking at students who are moving from the lowest level below to approaching, and also looking at students who are moving from on track to the top level, mastered. And then, of course, this methodology supports not only the Tennessee State statute for A through F, but also the ESSA requirements. So I think that we've had a pretty robust conversation along the way. This is something that I think you all can appreciate. It's hard to do. It's hard to satisfy every constituency and every context because there's lots of them. And frankly, in our state, we do have a tradition of focusing on continuous improvement. And that focus on continuous improvement is what's been driving our gains in terms of data that we've seen on NAEP and on national benchmarks like ACT. So that philosophy does underpin A through F. And as we know, we deal in a reality where schools do have student assignment that ends up clustering students that are high poverty together and affluent students together. We are dealing in that real context of looking at how do we make sure that schools are not just being graded based on the attendance zone versus what's actually happening in the school. So we tried to balance all of those thought processes while thinking about what kind of information do we think is important to parents as they make decisions about where to send their children and whether or not their school is really meeting the needs of their students. So with that, I open it up for additional questions.
Really good, good discussion. Other questions? Wendy?
Talking, right. So I want to first say I do appreciate that this isn't easy. So I couldn't have created it anything close. So I'm not, but I do for parents feel, and because I follow the legislature on this, feel like I'm invested in making sure that it's the best possible tool for parents. So one question I have is, a prior version of this that I saw had samples of like a bottom 8% school that was an A, right? I'm not imagining that. My superintendent showed me his slides. So is that?
You're talking about a case study that we did with
Sure.
Yes.
Okay. So in that case study where you have a school in the bottom 8% and it gets an overall A, where would a parent be able to go, assuming they have access to a computer and have the incentive to go digging deeper, that would show what the actual achievement level is?
So it's in the same place, the state report card, right? I mean, any of those indicators, if you click into, as we envision it, into that A on the achievement grade, we would pop up and show you the success rates and show you the criteria that earned that school an A in achievement. I'll say this about the case studies. What we wanted to do is make sure when we talk through with our stakeholder groups with the case studies is that we wanted to show extremes on either end, right? So we have, as Mary noted in the modeling, overall, absolute achievement is driving the model. So let me say that again. Absolute achievement is driving the model. The schools that are earning an A, that's exactly right. The schools with the A's have higher absolute achievement. Schools with B's have lower achievement, C's even lower, D's lowest on average, and F's are the worst, right? Because we modeled it that way. But at the same time, when we talked about our guiding principles and we wanted to talk about this with our stakeholders and be transparent, we wanted to show them two extremes. And so we do have a school that's a very low achieving school that's also been making phenomenal progress in terms of turnaround. And we showed that example because we did want people to see that you would have, and it's really an N of one, of a school that's that low achieving that was also able to demonstrate that kind of dramatic growth that would get them to the overall earning of an A. And so we didn't show you all scatter plots, but you can see that in general, you know, we pulled out the scatter plots because that people tend to glaze over when we show those. But you can see that I mean, it's difficult to do. There are not going to be many low achieving schools that are in that A category, but we do want to make sure that when something phenomenal is happening at a school, that we are giving credit and recognition for that in a way that calls it out and says this is A-level recognition. On the other side, we also show the example of a high achieving school that had very weak indicators around growth and around subgroup performance. And so a high absolute achievement school that has low growth and low subgroup performance ended up in the category of C. And again, that's rare because as you noted in the A category, most of those schools are also high growing. So let me say that again. In the A category, those higher achieving schools, only one of them had a TVOS growth level of 1. 6 had a TVOS growth level of 2. So the majority of those schools that are higher achieving schools are also making growth that's at or above expectations. It is rare in our state that you have a high achieving school that doesn't have meeting expected growth. But when that happens, we are calling out through this report card and this letter grade that that's an area of opportunity for that school. And that's a place where, as a parent, I'd want to know that the academic press in that school and serving of equity in that school is not such that that's an A school, just because of the achievement, right? So we put these indicators in, and we show those two extremes because we really did want for our stakeholders, particularly our directors of schools to like, let's see, people get, they get excited, they agree with the guiding principles, and then we're like, well, let's show you 2 examples where can you still stand behind those guiding principles when you see these 2 outlier examples. For some of them that broke down, and for some of them, they were like, I get it. We had some, directors of affluent districts who said, yeah, that would be a C school, because if you're high achieving and you're not growing and you're not serving subgroups, I want that school to be labeled a C.
Okay,
So-
other,
I just want to make, so in the vision of this dashboard, then my question, if that bottom whatever percent school has an A, the parent can click on the achievement and it will show percent proficient advanced blank. Like it'll be easy for them if they have a computer, if they know how to click, they'll be able to get that. It won't be you have to go to the report card, which requires a graduate degree.
I do think that we'd actually go through lots of focus group rounds, right?
Okay.
We've got a
Vision is
tradition
different
right
methods.
now,
And we
just
don't
like
have
the
to
new
click every
reports.
part of it. It's sort of like the iterations of this report card for each
Exactly.
grade,
And I
there's
asked
a
all
report
these
card for
same
K-12.
questions
Exactly
there,
right.
so don't.
Mhm.
That's why you get to be on our team.
I'm
Mhm.
happy to. And then one other question before feeling throw something at, well,
Yeah.
if you're-
I'm close.
No.
Go ahead.
I warned you.
Let me,
So on the,
Oh.
hold on, Mike.
Go ahead.
Also on the chronic absenteeism or whatever the title is, the calculation when I saw it included in-school and out-of-school suspensions, and they were weighted equally. Is that still part of that calculation? I know
The
there's
only thing that's in there would be your out-of-school suspension.
Okay.
In-school suspension is not,
is no longer.
and your absences. So, Nikki, you can speak to what's not in there.
Okay.
In-school suspension is not in there, expulsions is not in there because they're technically withdrawn, and alternative school placement, because you're actually in another. So the
Okay.
in-school would be considered, you probably have something that you learned when you're in in-school.
But it was in-school plus out-of-school. Okay.
It may have
Well,
been in one iteration.
we've talked about discipline, and ultimately we do want to get to a place where we just don't collect the data at that granularity, where we do talk about in-school suspension, right? Where you're not with your teacher of record. But we actually never, that's in a vision of if we bring in multiple
Right.
indicators.
The only thing
But
that's
right
now-
now,
Okay,
out-of-school
and because my
suspension.
question on that was going to be how you would weight that and how you would make sure it was quality time. And I know that's real. And then my maybe last question was fun.
You keep promising.
So at the high school level, I know it's not here now, but is there any vision of including something on like tracking post-secondary for those students? Because high school graduation rate is fantastic, but what's the percentage of kids in Tennessee who are testing college and career ready on the ACT? It's very low. A lot lower than that 80-something%. So,
We are looking at.
that was released like 2 weeks ago.
The answer is yes, we're starting,
Okay.
that's on that chart of metrics that we'll be tracking. It'll be matriculation, plus we'll be looking at completion,
excellent.
which will be one of the, I think, again, some of the metrics get me really excited. And you can be excited about metrics. That is one of them because it's going to tell stories that we haven't really ever put on a report card before.
As a parent, yeah, looking at high schools, I would want to see not how many kids get a diploma and walk across stage, but how many.
Yeah.
So-
Mike, you had a question, comment?
Yeah, I think my struggle has been, and is that we are ranking the top an A as the best performing and the F is the worst performing, rather than looking at an A being an A and a B. Because when I went on to, and I looked at all their schools, I was obsessive. But what I did was I took the population of the school and I calculated the raw numbers of the percentages of those metrics. And most of our schools, and again, Knox County outperformed.
We lost. That was profound.
That's what we could do for Wendy.
That's why I'm very loud.
Okay. Mike, are you there or are you gone? Sounds like he's gone.
I could probably come up with some questions.
Gone. One of the things I guess that I was looking at, I think the whole process we got here is very good to structure. I guess me and probably everybody else can argue some with the weights that you've got on the thing. And I guess I'd be interested in where you get any feedback about the ready to graduate thing needs to be higher. You know, to me, that's kind of the end test of where we're trying to get to, and we don't have it as rated as high. Now, I can go through there, and you know, my personal rates will be slightly different than you got, and I think everybody's would be, but I'm just interested.
Oh, man, the
guess I-
weight, the percent weighting on ready
Yeah.
graduate,
I'll
yeah.
get to that, particularly what Essa says about that particular indicator
Sure.
and the way.
Purpose of death.
Oh, sorry, Mike,
Mike.
are you back? Uh-oh.
Did I get up and leave and
You, we missed out your last half hour of discussion on it.
I think I missed out on it as well. But I was magnificent.
He said he was magnificent. We missed all his
Yeah.
insights.
Well, I don't want to listen to myself again.
Okay, I'm sure that you'll make sure we get the importance, or all the important parts of your discussion.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay. Okay, great.
So the point about ESSA does have requirements that says that you must include these additional measures of school quality and student success, but it explicitly says that the most significant weight has to go to achievement and growth in the model. So those additional indicators can't be weighted so much so as to be tipping away from. So we landed at 20% for the Ready Graduate indicator and pulled graduation rate into that. But I do think, you know, we still got chronic absenteeism in high school, and that's 10%. So we definitely can have conversations as to, you know, does 20% feel like the right weighting? Does 25% feel like the right weighting? And maybe, you know, 5% to chronic absenteeism. But then we get to a point where people say, well, do you have diminishing returns? Does 5% even matter? Is that a throwaway? So we certainly had lots of conversations about that. I will note though, and people, because we didn't show this as an example, but when we do that Ready Graduate index and show those percentages, I mean, we are going to have a moment of, you know, sticker shock. We've been talking about our 88.5% graduation rate. If we were to run through those Ready Graduate measurements with those checks, Mary, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is using just the low bar for participation. That number looks like 40% for the state, right? And once we layer in the requirement that you actually do the challenge exam, so we're going to have a different conversation about what does it mean to graduate from our high schools that I think will be a good one towards increasing the rigor and preparation for post-secondary and workforce.
When will that conversation occur?
Well, it's sort of happening now, Mike. I mean, because obviously we're sharing this with superintendents and others, and so it's really beginning. Again, it's still in draft form. It's not something that's been approved yet, and we're still getting feedback. The folks are starting to talk about how would I go back and start implementing this inside the district. You know, how can I get help with that? You know, what training do I need? How do they need to be thinking about sharing of these early post-secondary teachers potentially and some networks? That's been some interesting conversation in one of the regions because they feel like, you know, I've got one teacher, but could we share where all the students that need that AP course go to this particular high school and thinking about transportation? So they're going to be hard conversations too, but I think healthy ones, and they're already starting now. Of course, as this is approved and we move it forward, we would begin the more detailed. Let's dig into these and see how we're going to meet these goals.
Okay.
Just
Other
one-
questions, comments there?
And I should know the answers, I think, but I'm still a little confused. So ESSA requires us for 18-19 to run these sort of designations, but the state law is 17-18. When would the first report cards with these letters
It would be
generated?
based on 17-18 data.
Data.
Okay,
it would
but they
be
would come
running
out
in
sort of
18,
in
but-
18.
right,
That's where I've been confused. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Other questions, comments? Okay, good presentation, good discussion. Appreciate the input, and I'm sure that we got some folks that maybe want to provide some additional input offline. So encourage you to do that. Okay, we'll move to the action item we have on final reading, the high school policy 2.103. Laura?
All right. So as many of you are aware, we have been hard at work at getting this high school policy fully updated for much of the last year. I think this is its I think it's been on an agenda at every state board meeting this year. So we're hoping that we're really getting to the finish line, but we're also getting a lot of great feedback on different components of it. And so the policy was updated this summer, and then there were some minor updates that were made on first reading in October, and we've since received some additional feedback and are bringing some additional updates to you on final reading today. So a couple of highlights of the places where there have been changes to the policy. So the first one has to do with providing some additional clarity on the ACT graduation requirement. Nothing substantial on this requirement has changed since the changes on first reading, but we're just providing some additional clarity in the language to make it clear. There is some confusion amongst different stakeholders that an ACT test taken at any point during the high school period would count towards that high school graduation requirement of having taken the ACT. The other piece that is significant about the policy, and the reason that it is before you now in December rather than in January, has to do with the weighting of the end of course exams and the student's final course grade. So we've received a lot of feedback on this particular component, and it was really particularly important for the board to look at this now in December so that if approved, the changes would be in place for those students who are enrolled in block schedule versions of the courses this fall, so that they would have the same weighting on their end of course exams. The end of course exam would factor the same weight into their final course grade as it would for students who are in the entire year version of the course, the 2-semester version of the course. We've also clarified that, still existing in that section actually, but a point of clarification is that districts still have to establish a local policy which outlines the particulars of how they would convert those end of course scores into the final grade. So that has to do with end of course pieces, and we've updated the language to reflect that it's the final course grade rather than, I think the language previously was a little confusing around semester grades, and that had an impact on block schedules. And so then the final group of changes have been made to the credit recovery section. So we've worked closely with a group convened by TDOE to take a look at the credit recovery section of the policy and to provide some feedback. So we've clarified a couple of different things. First and foremost, that credit recovery should be standards-based. Previously, it mentioned that credit recovery was a skills-based remediation program, but really wanted to focus on the fact that it is about students mastering the standards of that course. We've also updated the entry requirements for credit recovery so that it reflects, districts basically have an option that it can either be the student's grade in the failing course that they received, or it can be through a diagnostic exam that they take. But it still holds into place that credit recovery is intended to be remediation, and so if a student has significantly failed a course, mastering less than 50% of the standards, earning less than 50% of the grade, they would need to retake that entire course. Credit recovery at this point in time would not be a good option for them because it really is intended to remediate, not to reteach significant portions of the course. And then finally, we made some updates to give additional clarity around the roles of the credit recovery teacher of record versus the credit recovery facilitator. So I'm happy to answer any questions there might be about those updates.
Okay, questions for Laura?
Oh, I need to kind of go through this so others could probably ought to go. I've got a number of notes that, but why don't you others go and then I'll back clean up. Maybe I'll get mine answered on the way.
Okay.
Mike, this is Sarah. I just kind of, for the record, wanted one point of clarification because I know when Lillian and I were with the Upper Cumberland Superintendent Study Council recently, we got a question from a new superintendent there, sort of a little confused about what it would mean, I think, around this local policy around sort of the grading methodology, given the timing, the data return, and what sort of decision points local districts are going to need to make as part of that. You know, each LEA must establish a local board policy that details the methodology used. Because I think in this case, they were asking about, you know, if a district was doing graduation May 15th and the scores went back till May 22nd, how would they handle that situation? Can you just talk a little bit, or anybody from the department, about sort of how you expect LEAs will kind of take some of those decision points? What are the most common things they'll have to be deciding as part of that board?
Sure, I can start and others can jump in. I think that's where the local policy piece really comes into play. So as the policy states that if they don't have scores back at least 5 instructional days before the scheduled end of the course, they don't have to use those in final course grades. But some districts may want to extend that timeline past 5 days. And so that could be something that they lay out in their local policy about how much additional time do they want to allow for those end of course grades to come in if they'd still like to use those. Additionally, they really are going to have to lay out the methodology of how they are going to calculate the specific grade. So the end of course scores come back and have to then be converted and weighted into the student's final grade.
We'll have to back up some, but I want to go to that. So I think thought I was following that, but then I want to, on page 11, under V, if an LEA does not receive its students' end-of-course exam scores at least 5 instructional days before the scheduled end of the course, then the LEA may choose not to include its students' end-of-course exam scores in the student's final course. Why is that?
So that's intended to ensure that as districts are wrapping up their end of course grading, that they have a sufficient time window to incorporate those grades, and then it allows them flexibility if they, for some reason, are not getting those grades back in time, to not hold up things like graduation perhaps, or other end of year wrap up things that might be happening.
And I was going to add, and this language was added to align with state statute regarding grades 3-8. So we are in a little bit of a split governance here for 3-8 versus 9-12. And when the state legislature moves on 3-8, then we try to make sure that we keep 9-12 in alignment. And this language around the 5 days before the end of the instructional period was added 2 years ago for grades 3-8.
So being the cynical person I am, it would be a end of course exam could be delayed intentionally in order to not have to include it in the student grade.
No, not with the way that the the testing window plays out. That the last date of that testing window, if I'm correct here, is that it would still allow sufficient time for those exam scores to come back before that 5-day window. So this is just a worst case scenario.
Meaning the district could not delay it to a point that their decision to delay it would have been the reason why they were late. Everyone has a specific end date, right? The window ends on December 16th, this particular fall block. And so that is for everyone. Everyone had to be finished by the 16th. So it would be a state issue if they were delayed, which has happened. That's why that particular language is in the policy.
Well, I guess I haven't seen that as a state issue all the way around. It's just the state has to get it back in 5 days, basically. Okay.
Hey, on page 4, I'm looking at L and M may be waived under certain circumstances. Give me an example. That's pretty broad.
Yeah, so an example of that would be if a student, and we see this particularly students who are enrolled in CTE courses decide to expand that career cluster and take additional courses in the CTE area, then they would not, a district could choose to waive the fine arts or foreign language credit for them so that they could devote more attention and more time throughout their 4 years to pursuing coursework in that CTE area.
One good example would be substituting computer code writing for foreign language. On the next page on 5, that's an O, if the code requires that a full year of computer education is provided, why do we just not require it? Why is it not just part of graduation requirement if the code requires it?
So I think it could happen at multiple different grade levels. So I don't think that the statute would prescribe that this necessarily has to happen at the high school level, but could be happening for students earlier in their educational career.
Under P, and I apologize for that, but students who take and pass dual enrollment courses at a post-secondary institution must have their post-secondary credits accepted by their local high school for credit. I could see where they would approve the course, but just like UT and the Regents had to go through an articulation agreement, seems like in regard at least to TCAT, Regents, and UT, we ought to accept their courses under an articulation agreement.
Yes, I think that's the intent of creating this set or outlining this in the policies to make sure that's clear that local districts should accept those courses for credit for students.
So can we strike must have their post-secondary credits accepted by the local high school for credit?
So that would be the mechanism by which we would make sure that that happens. Or maybe I'm not understanding correctly.
Well, it reads to me, unless I'm reading it wrong, that it's in the school's discretion as to whether they accept a dual credit course as applying toward their curriculum or our curriculum, whoever.
I don't read it that way, Mike. This is
Yeah, I don't
really,
either, but
I read it as this is what they must do. They are required to do this. Must have.
But it's saying students.
The last couple words of that first sentence.
It needs to be.
I read it as this is the clarity that's needed so that they understand that they must do this.
I think it would be better if, like, the local high schools must accept students.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Good catch, Mike.
Yeah.
Okay.
Consider that a technical
So
change.
on page 6,
I would say that's a technical change.
We'll bring that up.
Yeah.
I think it's
Semantics.
so on early graduation, move on when ready, which I was sort of wanting to add, don't move on till ready. But one of those requirements is recognized language proficiency assessment. Does that mean if language had been waived for certain circumstances, quote unquote, that this person could not move on when ready?
That is correct. They would have to have the language proficiency exam taken and a passing score on that in order to qualify for the move on when ready provision. And that language proficiency piece is outlined in the move on when ready statute. There isn't an option to waive.
They need to know the consequences before they pull that trigger.
Correct.
All right, so work-based learning, which is
what page?
I'm in on page 8. This is in Lillian and my wheelhouse. First sentence, students will have access to a system of structured work-based learning experiences that allows them to apply classroom theories and practice practical problems and to explore career options. That sentence does not provide limits. So a school district would, a student, any student who wants a work-based, which I am just absolutely gleeful about. But it's my impression that school districts' capacity to set these programs up to recruit the employers, and in the broad breadth that would cover a broad span of career options. It's very limited in Knox County, and there's a whole lot of careers out there that we would hopefully want kids to get into. The thing are they allowed to what extent limit this requirement And two, this is the one that, if it's done right, and we spent a lot of time looking at this as chambers, I can't fathom how it doesn't have a physical impact. Just to manage this is an awesome task if it's done with fidelity. So the question is, does this come with discretionary limitations? Obviously it does, but how much can they limit it? Can they do 5 programs at 2 out of 15 high schools and call it a day?
I think so. Under this interpretation, they would be able to place limits on that.
That's important because it would really, really help. The more we get, they're basically internships, and these internships are gold to employers, and when they come out with a certificate or those credit courses. I'm almost finished, Phil. On page 14, triple I. It's not really. This will be simple. What's the difference? I know what I think I know what a credit recovery teacher is. What's a credit recovery facilitator?
So we want to distinguish between the two here. So often credit recovery programs take place with the use of technologies, some type of computer programming. And so there may be what we would term a facilitator who is in the classroom on a daily basis, who's kind of monitoring students' progress through that credit recovery coursework. But we also wanted to ensure that because this is truly supposed to be a remediation opportunity that allows students to gain mastery of the standards that they were missing when they initially took the course, we wanted to make sure that any student enrolled in credit recovery would also have access to a credit recovery teacher of record, which would be a teacher who is endorsed to teach in that particular subject, who could help analyze the diagnostic results that the student took, who would be available to be on hand to provide one-on-one instruction if the credit recovery kind of online or technology solution is not helping a student in a particular, with a particular topic or a particular standard, that they would have access to someone who is ultimately responsible for making sure that they're progressing and that they're gaining mastery of those missing standards, is that credit recovery teacher of record, while they might interact on a daily basis with someone who's just facilitating and making sure that they're on task and that they're completing the coursework of the program.
Got it. I'm done.
Okay. Thank you, Mike. Good observations. Wendy.
Didn't think you'd look at me otherwise. So, not to beat a dead horse, but I'm going to beat a dead horse on the commissioner knows where I'm going here. On the ACT, everybody in the room, everybody here knows I'm not a fan of giving districts another year to do what the statute's required for a long time, but you all know that. My question is, when we talked about this at the last meeting, there was conversation about the transparency that would happen in this year for those districts that aren't doing 100%. So I know it was an accountability measure under the waiver. Foggy on where the waiver into ESSA space is. And so I guess my simple question is, after this year, how will people be able to see clearly what percentage of kids that were supposed to be tested under the law were tested by this?
Well, let's share what we're doing this year and then what we're doing.
So this year, we did not run our accountability for 2015-16 on that data based on the disruption to testing. We did publish, of course, the ACT information, and on our data downloads page is where we posted all the participation rate information.
It's public.
It's public.
In fact, we've had reporters, Wendy, just for your knowledge, reach out directly even within the last week, because we put out our report card yesterday, all the report card results from K-12.
Right.
And just specifically asking for all, so we've answered a lot of just media requests. What's your participation rate
On the ACT?
ACT?
That wasn't me.
No. Oh, you called it, yeah.
Yeah, so no, and in the future, we'll bring it into, you know, the accountability pages where we typically report, the participation rate for any tested subject that we include in accountability.
Okay, other questions? Okay, is there a motion that we approve this on final reading with the kind of technical correction that we identified there in that one sentence?
So move, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Cato. Second? Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mike. Wait. Okay, any other,
Hey, one more, just, saying technical correction. On page 14, IB, well, just read that and see if that sentence needs to be restructured. It seems like shall track designated students or shall track and designate students. But I don't know.
which one are you on, Mike?
IB, page 14, up at the top, IB.
And
Laura, just look at it, see if it needs.
and a copy of it.
Yeah, yeah. Again, thank you, Mike. You spent some time on this. Appreciate it. Okay,
Hey,
other,
I want to grade.
agreed.
I can go see.
He is making progress though, isn't he? He's getting better.
Teacher above average, Mike.
Yeah.
Value add.
Okay, other questions? Okay, Phyllis, if you could call the roll, please.
Ms. Chansey,
Aye.
Mr. Edwards,
Aye.
Mr. Ferguson,
Aye.
Ms. Hartgrove,
Aye.
Mr. Johnson,
Aye.
Ms. Kim.
Aye.
Dr. Trapp, Ms. Tucker,
Aye.
Mr. Austin.
Aye. The ayes have it. It's unanimous. Appreciate it. Laura, good work. Everybody, good work. A lot of good work here. It's been a great day, you know, between the launch of the report card and this discussion here this afternoon. Been a great day. Phyllis made me promise that I wasn't gonna make a big deal about her retirement. I'm not. But I am gonna have to get a brand new line. You know, I've gotten so used to say, Phyllis, could you call the roll? That ain't gonna work anymore. So Phyllis, we really appreciate what you've done for us for many years. We do appreciate it more than we wish you well.
Thank you.
Just so you know, we're going to duly celebrate her tomorrow in the way that she has endorsed. It's not going to be a big deal, but it'll be special.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else? Okay, with that, we are adjourned. Appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Cato.